Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Tian Wei. It's wonderful to be back in Davos for the World Economic Forum. And our session is about decarbonizing supply chains, leaving no one behind. The reason we are discussing it today is we all know there is a shared goal for all of us for decarbonization, and yet the supply chain could be a very critical and important component of it. But in the emerging and developing countries, there could be the thing about leaving behind. That's why we need to search for solutions. So how to decarbonize the supply chain? For those who are the stakeholders providing solutions, this is not a session about problems, but a session about solutions, are sitting with us, and I'm very honored to introduce them one by one. Sitting from my left side, we have from the government side, in a way, Jose Alejandro Rojas Pardini, the Minister of Private Investment of Panama. Mr. Minister, good to see you. I hope I pronounced all your name right.
Perfect.
Okay, thank you so much. Also, we have Jacques Vandermeiren, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the Port of Antwerp, Bruges, from Belgium. Good to see you, sir.
Thank you for having me.
And my friend over there, Helen Mountford, Chief Executive Officer of Climate Works Foundation with the US. Good to see you. Last but certainly not least, we have Niclas Mårtensson. Good to see you as well.
Thank you.
Now, we are going into a discussion, a panel discussion later. For now, I want to do two things. One is a notice coming from the organizer about how you are going to interact with us. Earlier, I saw a gentleman, one person occupy a whole couch. We need to keep all yourself awake. So you are going to ask questions. So you can raise your hands to ask questions later in our Q&A session, or use Slido, which is over here. You can use your little mobile phone to work with that. We're going to select questions from here and also from the floor. But another important message, and I'm very honored here to share with you, is that we have a wonderful opening speech coming from someone who cares about the topic that we are talking about today: trade, supply chains, emerging economies, and developing countries. So my great honor to introduce the opening speaker, Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, Director General of the World Trade Organization. So good to see you.
Thank you, too. What a wonderful panel. Now, it's so nice to be here. This is a really important topic. I don't normally read speeches. Those who know me know that. But today I'm going to read a speech because some of these messages are so important. I want to make sure I get them all out. So bear with me. We know that trade and supply chains are essential for scaling up the production and diffusion of the green technologies that are necessary to ensure sustainable growth free from carbon pollution. Last year's edition of the WTO's flagship World Trade Report, which we launched during COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, had a clear message. Trade is the missing piece of the climate puzzle. Trade is part of the solution. To take one example, the report showed that 40% of the dramatic cost decline of solar panel systems over the last 30 years is linked to scale economies promoted by trade. So we need trade and supply chains to get to net zero. But to get to net zero, we also need to decarbonize trade and supply chains. Today's event is precisely about the nuts and bolts of how to do this, and importantly, how to do it in a way that ensures a just transition, leaving no one behind. Supply chain decarbonization presents real risks for developing countries. They will need to have the capacity and infrastructure to demonstrate the low carbon content of their goods and services. Some have export baskets that are currently tilted heavily towards high carbon goods. At the same time, there are also immense opportunities for developing countries to leapfrog and avoid locking in trillions of dollars in high carbon productive and supply chain infrastructure. So we have a duty to ensure that everyone, everywhere can participate in a low carbon global economy. For this, we need a renewed and revamped kind of globalization and multilateral trade cooperation. Let me spell out a few potential areas for action. One deals with the traditional bread and butter of trade policy, namely market access barriers. Evidence shows that tariffs are often skewed in favor of high carbon products, with import duties higher on greener goods. I've been calling on WTO members to resume efforts to liberalize trade in environmental goods and services, bearing in mind all the sensitivities of developing countries who may want to do some manufacturing of these goods, and some developed countries who are very sensitive on where the benefits of such liberalization are concentrated. But we need to move on it. Because of countries' widespread tendency to impose higher tariffs on relatively clean finished goods, but lower tariffs on often more polluting inputs and intermediates, trade policy skews in favor of dirtier products. Joseph Shapiro at Berkeley estimates the resulting implicit subsidy to CO2 production between $550 to $800 billion a year. He estimates that eliminating the environmental bias in trade policy by imposing a single tariff and non-tariff barrier structure across all industries would reduce global carbon emissions by 3.6%, whilst increasing global real income by 0.65%. Another area deals with carbon pricing, where we already see about 70 different fragmented schemes with varying prices, scopes, and ambitions, leading to uncertainty, competitiveness concerns, and fears of disruptive unilateral action. I remain convinced that a shared global pricing framework would best provide certainty for businesses and predictability for developing countries. We've been working with other institutions such as the World Bank, the OECD, and the IMF on carbon pricing methodologies. A third area is standards and regulatory issues, where once again fragmentation will only complicate matters and increase costs for companies everywhere, but especially in developing countries. Consider steel, a critical product that has traditionally been very carbon intensive. In this one sector alone, there are at least 20 different decarbonization standards and initiatives. Too many divergent carbon metric yardsticks can significantly complicate decarbonization efforts. Some positive news here is that governments have a track record of using the WTO as a forum for discussing regulatory measures and nipping potential trade irritants in the bud. Our database shows that WTO members have notified more than 4,600 climate-related trade measures since 2009. But these WTO committee processes are only as effective as members want them to be. To decarbonize supply chains, we will need to get into the nuts and bolts of each sector to reach shared understandings about how to calculate and certify carbon footprints and develop appropriate international standards. Finally, the low-carbon globalization we are seeking to foster must not continue the shortcomings of the global economy as it has evolved up until now, let alone make them worse. We know that in the decades leading up to the pandemic, global trade and the spread of supply chain activity helped lift over 1 billion people out of poverty. Per capita incomes in developing economies began to narrow the gap with rich countries, but we know there were also problems. Too many people and too many countries were left out of the gains. And as we've all learned from the disruptions and shortages of the past 3 years, there were real vulnerabilities in supply chains, much of this due to excessive concentration in where some products, like vaccines, for instance, are made. Deeper, more diversified markets would have been less fragile. We also know that about semiconductors. We see echoes of the same fragility in the growing green economy, with supply chains for certain key low-carbon technologies presently concentrated in a small number of countries or regions. we can build a greener, more resilient, and more inclusive global economy by bringing people and countries currently on the margins of supply networks into new low-carbon value chains, and by helping developing countries with high carbon export baskets to diversify. Bringing more women-owned businesses and micro, small, and medium enterprises into green supply chains would also help build resilience for the world, while at the same time including those who have been left out. This is a big agenda, but I know we can do it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Madam Director, thank you so much, Madam Director General, for pointing out the problems and the challenges while at the same time leading us to the solutions. Let's focus on the solutions because they are trying to provide the solutions. Now, Mr. Minister, you are coming from the government, and we see Madam Director General pointing out several things. Technology, funding, standards, and lack of some of the resiliency issues. So what do you see is the biggest challenge to you and your country as a developing country?
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Honored to be here. I think that is the biggest challenge is that there's a big difference between developed and underdeveloped countries regarding what are the resources and how we can make a global, because the complexities is that you have to kind of make almost at the same time whatever solution we go into. I'll give you an example. When the Panama Canal was expanded and when that decision was made, it took around 6-7 years of doing road shows. And when those road shows were being done, you had to get the different ports, specifically the ports in the United States on the Atlantic side, that they would buy into it. Because what would it work? It wouldn't have worked if you expand the canal and then you wouldn't have the use for it on the Atlantic side. So examples, Port of Houston and also in Miami, many ports that had to go through dredging and through expansions. Part of the situation here is that we have to all move kind of at the same time. It's very hard if we're going to be moving at different times. So we need to find ways of doing it. We understand in Panama, I mean when we look at our multimodal platform, logistical platform, people think only sometimes about the Panama Canal, but we do have the most important port system in Latin America, and actually we're expanding the capacity by 60%, a new port that's going to be built in the Atlantic. That it's a private investment, and the idea is to have the most modern and biggest port in Latin America. But part of when we look at Panama, we're very concerned about the environment. It's not only being concerned, but working on it. I'll give you examples. 30% of our land is a natural reserve, and the same 30% of our oceans are a natural reserve. And we are one of the few handful of countries that are carbon negative. So we believe that taking care of the environment is the right way to go. We first had IMO 2020, but then it changed to IMO 2030. Still, the world hasn't decided where we're going to go. We're going to go to biomethanol, or we're going to go to natural gas. Which way we're headed. What we're trying to do is to find other complementary uses so that we build the infrastructure not being sure completely of where we're headed, because no one, we haven't all get into an agreement of where we're headed. So I'll give you examples. We have in the Panama Canal, inside the Panama Canal, we have a $1 billion natural gas facility. In case that we're headed that way. It started because it was more for energy, for having firm capacity, but understanding that there could be the opportunity there to expand for shipping if that would be the case. And now we're increasing the capacity and we're having a $1.2 billion investment also next to it on natural gas. But since governments, we believe either that governments really have to create the conditions and the public policy, so and have the private sector making these investments, in some cases, public-private, like the $1.2 billion project I just talked about, that it's Panama has 25% of the shares. But we're also pushing for, there's a private group in which involves Goldman Sachs, Fluor, different companies.
I see.
And they're pushing for a $7 billion biorefinery and looking at also producing green hydrogen. So we are not completely sure where we're headed, but we want to, in advance, trying to push understanding that you cannot build something only for a purpose, because until we have clarity of where we're going to head both ways or three ways or only one. So we're trying just to prepare and create a condition so that the private sector can help us. But if we're having that problem, I could imagine that there's many other places
who share the same
who have
or similar.
Or even bigger challenges.
I see. That's a great point because it's very pragmatic. A consensus about timetable and a consensus of shared goals. And also consensus about technologies and methods. On that, I want to go to Helen because you have been working with your partners, philanthropies, for example, to work on these decarbonizing projects, particularly in emerging and developing countries. So how are you figuring that out? You know, some of the problems that Mr. Minister frankly pointed out about lacking consensus of at this point.
Thanks very much. It's definitely a challenge. And one of the things we're looking at is not just as Ngozi so eloquently explained the whole challenge around decarbonizing supply chains, getting products moving, and how trade can play a role in that, but actually how do we transport those goods? And so we're working together with philanthropy, with partners on the ground in multiple countries around the world on how can we actually help to decarbonize shipping, how can we help to decarbonize trucking, and move that forward. And so just one example I can give from trucking, something very exciting that we launched as part of the Drive Electric campaign just last November. We launched a new initiative, a new fund called LEAP, which is Leapfrogging to E-Mobility Acceleration Partnership. So trying to do the leapfrogging that was mentioned before by Ngozi, and we're working with 10 countries. We've got Brazil, Burundi, Chile, Colombia, Kenya, Nigeria, Paraguay, Philippines, South Africa, and Uganda. And what we're doing with each of those is pilot testing approaches on the ground on how to leapfrog to e-mobility. So for example, in Brazil, that's working in Sao Paulo with partners to look at testing and piloting bus fleet and truck pilots, how we can do that. In Nigeria, it's actually research on how to set the right policy frameworks to help promote e-mobility. And in Bogota, in Colombia, we're looking at electric fleet mentorships. Again, trying to leapfrog some of the slower progress we've seen in other countries and regions and get to these solutions quicker. Similarly, in shipping, there's a lot to be done. There's also massive opportunities.
I'm glad because you addressed some of the earlier concerns that Mr. Minister just mentioned, which is we do not know what is the best way, and therefore we have the pilot projects to show what might be the best way. There are two wonderful gentlemen sitting here coming from the business community. You have to know what you're doing because it's a business that you're running. There are bottom lines of business about creating values, for example, for your shareholders and the public. So when you know there are uncertainties, yet there's shared goals, what are you doing? How do you test and pilot and probably even have some good examples already that you can share here today? Jacques?
Well, pioneering together, if I can resume the whole thing or the whole approach. So we have to move from fossil fuels to renewable ones. So green molecules, green electrons, that's the future. And it's not if question, is how and what to do and who is doing what.
And that's where we are interested in.
Absolutely. And no one can bring the solution to the table and no one can solve the problem on its own. So we will have to collaborate and to cooperate, especially looking at the shipping industry, and Niclas will confirm in a minute the approach of shipping companies. But of course, the decarbonization of the shipping industry will happen on sea or in the waters, but also on land, because we will have to bunker. If Niclas believes in, for instance, green ammonia or green methanol as the future fuel for his ships, well, a ship sails from port to port. Then we need infrastructure in those ports and in every port, not only in the developed countries, but also in the other one. So you need a collective approach, and we need solutions that will be figured out by a community. And that's the wonderful thing here in Davos. We have a governors meeting regrouping all the big actors or main actors of the supply chain. Yeah. And we think in solutions for the future with shipping companies, but also with ports and with the forwarders.
So what are you doing right now?
Well, we are currently, the no-brain approach is infrastructure. We have to build the terminals, the pipelines, the storage capacity.
Give us a few examples that you think you would love to work with Niclas.
Well, if Niclas wants to use green ammonia, that green ammonia will have to be produced somewhere. And the interesting thing here is for producing green ammonia, you need lots of wind and sun and space. And we have that on Earth, not especially in Europe, but maybe you have them in Namibia or in Chile or in Australia or in Egypt or in Morocco or in Oman. And so we can invest, because we will need huge volumes of green ammonia or green methanol. So we will need wind farms and solar parks in remote places in the world, but in countries where there is a combination, ideal combination of wind and sun. And then we will have to build ports in those countries to liquefy the sun and liquefy the wind, and to export this to other places. And who will transport those volumes of green ammonia and green methanol, for instance? Well, it's the shipping industry, and they can use it as a fuel in the meantime. So that are the things we are discussing, and the big question is, who is investing in this approach?
Finally, we are reaching this stage. Who is investing? Yes. What about for you?
Well, from a Stena perspective, we actually started our sustainability journey already in 1989 by connecting our ships with a land-shore connection. 2013, we did the first conversion with existing ship into methanol. And the year after, we started a pilot with batteries on board the ship, so we can maneuver in and out of the port to reduce the CO2 emissions, but also the sounds. So I think it's very much up to each and everybody here to actually be starting up, not waiting for the other ones, to dare to take the first step. It costs, but we have a responsibility there. But then I think to combine all those initiatives, and now not only talking about Stena or the shipping industry, but talking about the entire transportation and supply, I think nobody can do it alone, but everybody can make it together in that case. And when I see, and there is a lot of frustration in us, where we see that there are willingness and there are a technology ready, but the infrastructure, as Jacques said, the infrastructure is sure to make it available with green energy. That's the puzzle we are missing here. Because if we get that one, and we got Helen investing in the small developing countries, who actually are the one who taking the big hit. They are not the big emissioners, but they are the one taking the big hit. Investing in the green infrastructure in West means also that then we can avoid the discussion about loss and damages. Because now all of a sudden we're trying to get so much money into loss and damages of the developing countries because the West continue living as we are. So I think the society need to come together invest in green infrastructure in West to reduce the damages and losses in the poorer countries, the developing countries, at the same time as we got the people who have the money close to their heart and want to make a better life here, then I think we start understanding. And then, as Minister also said, that countries actually do open up for businesses to dare to invest. To make that happen is extremely important from a governmental perspective, because we are interested in doing those investments.
I certainly applaud all your efforts and all your thinking. However, coming from an emerging economy myself, I think there's one thing a lot of people have in mind from our parts of the world, for example, that what about some of the leapfrogs we are talking about here? It is wonderful, leapfrogging of infrastructure, leapfrogging of technologies, but some of the very basic needs in the developing countries, Mr. Minister knows this better than I do, are still need to be taken care of. So they have a lack of funding, while at the same time they are fascinated by all these common shared goals that we are talking about here. So how to concentrate the resources to the right place, and there will be less waste of resources at the end of the day. And also to make sure the process would not be decades long, because people cannot just wait for a better future. I think that is also a question we really need to bear in mind. Mr. Minister, correct me if I'm wrong.
No, I completely agree. That's why, I mean, the funding, when there's uncertainty, it's hard to get that funding. And obviously, I think that the shipping industry, that in many cases also own ports, are the ones that can help us lead the way. They know about their costs. We don't know about their cost structure, but talking, together, then the policies can be done in order to push that. In our case, and to be blunt, we are still we passed a law recently on voluntary carbon credits, but we are very concerned about trying to do it right and having good quality, because it could be a way of funding some of these projects, but also in the past there has been mistakes on the quality of them. So it's the funding, without a doubt, is very important, and we'll need support of multilaterals and many other in order to create that.
Niclas, as a business person, you are here to provide solutions. That's your daily job. So what about the questions Mr. Minister just mentioned?
No, but I think I'm coming back. Of course, we dare to take risks. I think that's extremely important. And there are some projects that we can't always focusing on the P&L to the bottom line every day to make life better. But I think I'm coming back to, it's not just up to one part here. I think if with the willingness we see in the entire industry of supply chain, how we can actually capitalize on that willingness to open up more projects in those countries who are in the need of it. So the willingness is there. There are so many good examples when we see, for example, in the port of Gothenburg, we are together with Volvo Trucks and Scania cooperating in an electrified model for the future. And it's there. We want to do it, we can do it, but we don't have any electricity enough, which is green, to implement it. And there, of course, it's up to the government to start realize their part of this burden, if I excuse myself.
I like kicking the ball between the two of you. I like that. What about government preferential policy? Just briefly before I go to the other speakers. Please, Mr. Minister.
Well, again, I think in our case, 82% of the energy that we consumed last year was renewable.
Yes.
And we are pushing very hard on that, and that's why we're also you also need the firm capacity part, and that's why by 2025, I'll give you an example. We won't have any contracts on carbon or on bunker generating electricity plants. Okay, our firm capacity, we're going to get, well, batteries and all that keeps improving. We're betting on LNG, and that's why, you know, if we head that way, we believe we have something there. But if not, we have to keep looking for ways of creating energy that we could use for also other means in order to have that capacity that's needed. Because you can have the technology, but if you don't have the energy, then we cannot fix the solution.
We have to think through. Helen, you want to take that ball?
Thanks very much. Let me just talk about a little bit green shipping corridors, because I think there's an incredible potential here to work together across countries, but also with the shipping companies, with the consumer goods companies that are shipping their products, with ports in different regions to form partnerships where we really can look at applying these solutions in practice. So we had in Glasgow, the climate conference, and 2 years ago, we had 24 countries that committed to supporting green shipping corridors. We have ones that are developing now between LA and Shanghai. We've got one for mining companies between Australia and some ports in East Asia, looking at using ammonia-powered ships there. So we're starting to look at how to actually develop these. And again, it's something which I think can be very practical, applying at a local level. But I mean, if you take LA, Shanghai, that's one of the busiest transport routes for freight, right, on the seas. So it's a very practical approach, getting all the right stakeholders in the room, making sure there's the energy sources, there's the solutions in terms of fuels, making sure we've got the right ships, we've got the buy-in and the demand, to be frank, from those who are doing the shipping, who are shipping their products. And so it's really those partnerships and that leadership. But one more thing on this, if I could, just in terms of leadership, this is a moment where we have the climate crisis so much more stark. Where we are now is so much worse than where scientists thought we would be at this stage. And it's a very strong call here at Davos to wake up and to actually take the action we need. But also, if you look at shipping, for example, there's enormous effects on human health as well. 60,000 people die each year, it's estimated, from shipping fuel pollution, because it's a very heavy oil, very, very polluting fuel. So that is affecting people in different ports. So we have an opportunity here, and we've got an opportunity for leadership. We've seen that from a number of shipping companies. I'd mentioned Maersk as well, who back in 2018 set a net zero target for all of their shipping by 2050. And we're very clear, they didn't know how they were going to get there. But they were big enough, and they knew they could work with the manufacturers of the ships and with those who manufacture, produce the fuels to find the solutions. And since then, they've become even more ambitious.
I like that example. As they say, filling the stones while crossing the river.
Yes.
You test, you try to know how it works, and maybe eventually it works. Jacques, any inspiration?
Well, collective action is what we need in a very complex and very difficult supply chain. So collective action and leadership, and well, people and companies dare to pioneer and to invest. But we have to do this together. And the big question is, with global warming, what is the sense of urgency? What is the time frame that we have? Do we think we have decades, or what is the time frame?
What do you think?
Well, I think as a European, we have, as a continent, a Green Deal saying 2050 we want to be climate neutral. So that's a clear timeline. So then you have to do things. But the most important thing, 2050 is 27 years from here. The more interesting is to know 2030, where are we? And that's if we want to reduce the CO2 emissions by 2030, well, that's 7 years from here. And then we have to do things right now without knowing if the technological option is the right one. So again, it's pioneering, and we need a coalition of the willing. And I believe in seeing is believing, and walk the talk. And as a port, we have a small fleet compared to the fleet of Stena. It's a small fleet of tugboats.
Yeah.
And we will invest, and we did that, and in a few weeks we will inaugurate the first hydrogen tugboat in the world, which is the very first one. We will not solve the CO2 problem of the shipping industry, but there are more than 20,000 tugboats in the world. And hopefully they will all come to Antwerp to see that very first hydrogen tugboat. And if you can show that it works, then hopefully we will be copied. And
is that a big advertisement or what?
No, everyone is welcome always in Antwerp.
Right.
Now you have a very good reason to come.
Yes, please.
No, just saying, just what we heard from the General Secretary here before, how important the trade is, and then comparing that 90% of all the goods in the world are traded on the sea, with less than 3% of the emission, just to get some kind of dimension of the problem. But what's one of the road bumps here, what we see without getting the investments enough, we see that administration and regulatory is also a very bad barrier for us to focusing on the transition itself. All of a sudden, we need to create more administration to actually live up to all contradictions with KPIs that are in the world right now. So make it simple, because then it also will happen.
And I see, as a result of that, this conversation on the stage with all the stakeholders coming from policy, business, and also from organizations that are trying to link the two of them is extremely important. But I am probably the dumbest here in the room, because we have a lot of people who are in the business or who are already testing their solutions sitting there. So now shall we either use your Slido system, or you can raise your hand if you want to say something or comments, or say, oh, you're wrong, or yes, that's wonderful, or you have questions, feel free to raise your hand. Our colleagues will bring mics to you. Okay? Please.
Sitting in the company chair.
Well, you are walking the talk. Good for you.
Martin Chilcott from Manufacture 2030. In April, we're launching a supply chain engagement program to decarbonize the pharmaceutical industry's active pharmaceutical ingredient supply chain, which is largely in China and in India. Okay, it's about 8 pharmaceutical companies coming together to do it together to address this particular with their supply chain, which is the hottest bit. It's where their CO2 is concentrated. We know that a significant part of what has to happen is to electrify and renewably electrify the processes in those manufacturing, and going from all the things which are currently dirty electric powered, and including electrifying as much of the heating process as we possibly can. Over the last 2 days, I've heard several times concerns about permits and planning permissions in these countries in order to be able to enable these solutions to be delivered. And I've heard concerns about the roles or the reluctance of the development banks in providing capital for projects at the right price. I believe that the power of these, and it's probably going to be 10 major pharmaceutical companies in the end, so it's all the big ones we all know, their power, their pulling power, and their demand generation that those 500 odd supply companies can generate will provide a really interesting demand opportunity for development of an aggregated supersized power purchase agreement. I just wonder if the panel had any thoughts about how do we get governments to accelerate permitting? How do we get the development banks involved in a project like this?
Okay. After our session, you solve every problem. Anyone want to comment on that?
Maybe, and it's a very, very valid remark and concern, because permits and the planning is something that, especially in Europe, is becoming a real nightmare. It's on average, I spent 20 years of my previous career in the energy companies in high voltage lines. Try to build a high voltage line in Europe these days. It will take you on average 8 years before having all the permits. 8 years, the question is again, what is the sense of urgency? If we think that we can wait 10 years before having new offshore wind parks, of onshore wind parks, or wind or solar parks, yeah, then leave it like it is and change nothing on the permit. So indeed, something has to change, and in the Green Deal in Europe, the permit is one of the main concerns, how to reduce the time to, for instance, 1 year. Otherwise, you have the banks and other financial institutions looking at that investment, but there is no business case. So that, unfortunately, in the whole energy transition, you see many obstacles. And the big thing in the ecosystem is to identify these obstacles, and permits is certainly one of them. And who can bring solutions? Is this every national government? Is it the European Parliament? When it's for Europe. But I can imagine in China, in Dubai, in Singapore, they tackle this kind of issues differently. I think in China or in Singapore, you can get a permit much faster than in Europe. So you have to deal with those problems and bring, again, solutions to the table. Yeah. Because you can enumerate lots of obstacles for not doing something or not considering an investment. But
it is so difficult to do something good, you know, because you have to identify the issues on the chain and then solve every of those issues. So you're not alone. Okay, that's at least the answer you're getting, and we need to speed that up. So how should I go?
I would like to compliment because let's say I'm on the other side, I'm from the government, and I hear you and I agree with you.
And by the way, you are not representing every government.
Yeah. Well, actually, on my private life before having the job I have, I was a developer and builder. So I suffered exactly, you know, from the other hand, and that's kind of why the president created the job I have. Because it's more, to be honest, the title is Minister for Facilitating Private Investments, okay? Which basically means that once someone wants to invest, you need the government to, you know, walk with them so that they have some sort of concierge service, and you cut the excessive red tape and bureaucracy. When you're looking at sometimes when you're looking at the private government, at the government, people just think it's digitalizing. Actually, the way we have designed a system in which we see it in 4 quadrangles. The first one is regulatory. The second one is that there needs to be change management. So institution needs to do it because the institutions are the ones that drive that institution itself, okay, is going to do the business. The third is looking at processes, because if you have 40 steps and you should really have 5, then you're having 35 extra steps that become also opportunities for corruption. And then the fourth is looking, so you need to have the exact steps in which you have the adequate controls, that it's simple, but you're controlling risk. And then the fourth is to digitalize. And when we are looking, so that's how we're tackling every problem in digitalization. We're far from being either Europe or Estonia or anything like that, but that's the change management that we have looked at. And then the second thing is that in an order of events, what needs to be done always is simplify, before digitalizing, is simplify, standardize, because we're 193 countries. We are, I think there's 1,900 ports. I mean, there's many players. So we need to simplify, standardize, so we're always talking the same language, then digitalize, and then look for interoperability. But I think that's a huge problem. And
that's really going to the theme of this World Economic Forum, cooperation. We do not just talk about the differences. What's the use of that? Let's talk about how we can cooperate. Can I just have 30 seconds for both, for each of them. Sorry for giving you 30 seconds, but
No,
yeah, please.
no problem. Just to follow up on this question about the role of the development banks, because it is critical for what we're talking about, the infrastructure build, the new approaches in developing and emerging economies. And there was recently a study about the World Bank and their investment in public sector transport. And what was found was less than 2% of that investment was going to zero emission vehicles and infrastructure around that, and over 68% was going to fossil fuel-based infrastructure and development. So we need the development banks leading the way, working with countries to actually help to build some of this infrastructure.
All right.
Just adding on, based on the question there, and permission, 8 years, that's 2031. We should reduce our emissions with 50% for 2030, so we're already 1 year late. And the challenge here is everybody has the same solution, is to electrify with green energy. Shipping, trucking, production, everybody has the same solution, and it takes too long time to take the decisions from a perspective of actually implementing this. So I think
Everybody
there are double
walk the
challenges.
talk, right?
Yes.
That's it.
Voila.
Okay. All right. Well, sorry for the little time I left for all of you, but we're running out of time. I see a lot of energy and can-do spirit, including from our government officials. Mr. Minister, really wonderful. So may I, before we wrap it up, have someone who is most appropriate to wrap it up, because she has been working on this session and trying to bring these topics frontline to the during the World Economic Forum this year. Margie Van Gogh, who is the head of supply chain and transport with the World Economic Forum. Margie, please, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Humbled to be in a room with people who really are looking forward so far, yet recognizing that the need to act is right now. And so I'd prepared a few remarks, but I'm not going to use those, because what I've heard here from the Director General Ngozi, who comes from the continent I come from, she said, if we are going to be green and resilient, we truly need to be inclusive. And I think that is what this session has been about. And what I've heard from the Northwestern Hemisphere, and Minister Pardini, thank you so much for taking the time to be here as well, and coming from an emerging economy, understanding the complexity. You said we really need to ensure that we are coordinating and cohesive in the response that we take. Helen, leapfrogging, I love that. And I think that Africa can do that because we don't have the significant legacy infrastructures that many other places have. So wonderful opportunity for us to leapfrog both in trucking and in shipping, pilots in green corridors, really looking to support that. Jacques, it's not a question of if, but how. I love that. That's going somewhere. Thank you so much for the support that you provide, because there's no question that with the wind and the sun that we have in the developing markets, we are not just going to create new energy, we're going to create significant new jobs. New jobs provide new opportunities for Africa, other emerging markets to trade. We don't need aid, we need trade. And Niclas, thank you. I think dare to take the risk, phenomenal. I think we all need to dare to take the risk. And at the World Economic Forum, we are thrilled to work with partners across the value chains that are consistently initiating and incubating new programs, such as the First Mover Coalition. And I see many in the room here who are already connected to the work that we're doing around aggregating demand, insisting that we use procurement, government procurement, public sector procurement, and private sector investments, and a demand for greener solutions. So I couldn't be more thrilled to be part of this community. I think that supply chain, and we all realized this during the pandemic, is the reason we have food on our tables. It's the reason we have vaccines in arms. There is no question that disrupted supply chains do not work, and therefore, to close out digitization, simplification, standardization, and investment in the emerging markets to drive a global inclusive transition is fundamental. Thank you for doing this with us. I really appreciate it, and I appreciate this panel. And thank you so much, Wei, for being so agile in your response to the changes that we made today. Thank you.
It's my great pleasure. Thank you so much, Margie. I think this is what it is about. It's camaraderie. So thank you so much, everyone on the stage and off the stage. We're looking forward to future cooperation. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.